The wind in Dry Fork, Wyoming never told the truth. It whispered through the cottonwoods like a preacher hiding a secret, carrying dust, and sometimes carrying names that should have stayed buried. On the morning of October 3, 1887, that wind carried a name no one in town had spoken aloud in nearly a decade. A stagecoach rolled in just after sunrise, its wheels groaning under the weight of trunks that didn't belong to any woman a rancher would order by mail. Silas Blackwood, the tallest man in 3 counties, stood at the depot with a folded contract in his coat pocket and a bouquet of dried sagebrush in his fist. He was waiting for a bride, a quiet one, a church girl from St. Louis, promised through a broker, paid for in silver. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Whether you're on a porch in Texas, a kitchen in Ohio, or somewhere across the ocean, pull your chair a little closer. Sending love your way. Because what happened when that stagecoach door opened is a story folks in Dry Fork still won't tell after dark. The door swung wide. A boot hit the dirt, silver-tipped and scuffed. Then a second boot. And when the woman inside stepped out with a rifle slung across her back and eyes the color of gunpowder smoke, she looked Silas dead in the face and said 7 words that changed everything. "You bought the wrong bride, Mr. Blackwood." And the rancher smiled. Dry Fork wasn't much of a town. 14 buildings if you counted the outhouse behind the barbershop, and most folks did because it had a better roof than the schoolhouse. The main street ran 140 paces from end to end, hemmed in by a leaning general store, a saloon that never fully closed, a livery that always smelled of wet hay, and the sheriff's office with its cracked front window nobody had bothered to fix since the summer of '84. On that October morning, a thin fog clung to the ground like something reluctant to leave. The kind of fog that made a man's breath look like smoke and made every sound seem twice as loud. Silas Blackwood stood on the depot planks with his hat tipped low, his gray coat buttoned to the throat, and his boots polished to a shine that hadn't been seen in Dry Fork in years. He was 41 years old, 6'4", and carried himself with the quiet weight of a man who had buried more than he'd built. The Blackwood Ranch, 3 miles east, was the largest spread in the county. 2,000 head of cattle, 40 horses, a house made of hand-hewn timber that his father had raised in 1859 and that his mother had died in 6 winters later. Silas had run the place alone since he was 22. Alone, folks reminded each other because his first wife, Kora, had walked out into a blizzard one January night and never walked back. That was 10 years ago. He hadn't spoken her name since. The stagecoach rattled into view at 7 minutes past 6, the driver hollering a tired greeting to no one in particular. 2 horses, foam-flecked and worn, dragged the coach the last 100 feet and shuddered to a stop. The driver, a wiry man named Elias Coop, spat tobacco juice into the dust and gave Silas a look that Silas couldn't read. "Package from St. Louis, Mr. Blackwood," Elias said. "Reckon she's yours." Silas nodded once. That was all he ever gave. A nod, a word, sometimes a slow breath. He had been raised by a father who believed talk was a leak in a good bucket, and he had grown into a man who believed the same. The coach door didn't open right away. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that made the fog seem to lean in and listen. Then a boot came down. Silver-tipped, scuffed, the leather cracked from real riding, not from posing in St. Louis parlor. A second boot followed. And then the woman. She was tall. Not tall for a woman, tall for anyone. 5'10" if she was an inch, with shoulders that had carried weight and hands that had held a rope. Her hair was the color of dark honey pulled back in a single thick braid that fell down her back. She wore a canvas duster, gray-brown and coated in the dust of 3 states. A rifle was slung across her back, a Winchester .76, the wood worn smooth from years of use. And her eyes were the color of gunpowder smoke, gray and sharp and utterly still. She looked at Silas. She looked at the bouquet of sagebrush in his fist. She looked at the folded contract peeking out of his coat pocket. And then she said it. "You bought the wrong bride, Mr. Blackwood." For a moment, Dry Fork itself seemed to stop. Elias Coop paused mid-chew. A crow on the depot roof cocked its head. The fog didn't move. And Silas Blackwood, who had not smiled in 10 years, felt something old and buried shift in his chest. He smiled. It wasn't a broad smile. It wasn't a warm one. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he recognizes something he wasn't expecting to see again. A small, quiet, dangerous smile. And then, slowly, he lifted his hand and held it out to her. "Ma'am," he said, in a voice that hadn't been used in a while. "Welcome to Dry Fork." She didn't take his hand. She stared at it like it was a snake she wasn't yet decided on. Behind her, Elias Coop cleared his throat and swung down from the driver's box. He hauled 2 trunks off the roof of the coach, and one of them was heavier than any bride's trunk had a right to be. It landed on the planks with a metallic clunk. Silas's eyes moved to it, then back to her. "Name?" he asked. "Rhea," she said. "Rhea Callahan." Silas's smile didn't fade, but somewhere behind his eyes, a light went out and another one came on, because Callahan wasn't a name he had paid for. Callahan wasn't a name in the broker's ledger. Callahan was a name he had heard exactly once before in his life, 10 years back, spoken by a man dying on the floor of a saloon in Cheyenne. He lowered his hand. "Miss Callahan," he said quietly, "I think we'd better get you out of this fog." She looked at him a long moment. Then she nodded once, sharp, and picked up her own trunk like it weighed nothing. She followed him toward the wagon. And behind them, unseen by either, a man in a black coat stepped down from the far side of the stagecoach, watched them go, and disappeared into the mist. The wagon ride to the Blackwood Ranch was 3 miles of silence broken only by the creak of the wheels and the low breathing of the mule team. Silas didn't ask questions. Rhea didn't offer answers. She sat beside him on the buckboard, rifle across her knees, eyes moving constantly, scanning the ridgelines, the treeline, the road behind them. She sat like a woman who had been hunted before and expected to be hunted again. The land east of Dry Fork was a strange kind of beautiful. Grass the color of dry gold rolled in slow waves toward the foothills. Rocks the size of houses lay scattered like the leftovers of some giant's meal. A hawk circled overhead, wide and lazy, riding a current no living thing could see. And through it all, the wagon rolled on, its shadow long and thin in the morning light. At the top of a low rise, Silas pulled the mules to a stop. Below them, the Blackwood Ranch spread across the shallow valley like a painting. The main house was long and low, its roof a dark line against the pale grass. A barn stood to the north, red once, gray now. Corrals stretched east and south, and beyond them, cattle moved in slow clusters, black shapes against the gold. "That's it," Silas said. It was the first thing he had said since the depot. Rhea looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "It's smaller than I was told." Silas glanced at her. Told by who? She didn't answer. He clucked to the mules and the wagon rolled on. When they reached the yard, an old man came out of the barn to meet them, wiping his hands on a rag. His name was Hoke, and he had worked for the Blackwoods since before Silas was born. His hair was white, his back was bent, and his eyes were the sharpest thing in 3 counties. Hoke looked at Rhea. Rhea looked at Hoke. Neither of them spoke. Then Hoke turned to Silas and said, "That ain't the woman in the letter." "No," Silas said. "It ain't." Hoke chewed the inside of his cheek. He looked at the rifle across Rhea's back. He looked at the heavy trunk in the wagon bed. Then he nodded once, slow, and said, "I'll put on coffee." The house inside was cleaner than Rhea had expected. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, cold now, the ashes swept. A long pine table stood in the center of the room. 2 rocking chairs faced the fire. A rifle rack held 4 rifles, all oiled, all loaded. There were no pictures on the walls, no curtains at the windows. It was the house of a man who had stopped decorating a long time ago. Silas set her trunk down by the door. He did not offer to open it. He did not ask what was in it. He walked to the fireplace, knelt, and began building a fire with the slow, patient movements of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Rhea stood in the middle of the room watching him. "You're not going to ask me?" she said at last. "Ask you what?" Silas said, without turning. Who I am. Why I came. What happened to the woman you paid for? Silas struck a match. The flame caught the tinder. A soft glow spread across the hearth. I figure, he said. You'll tell me when you're ready. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough for the fire to take hold. Long enough for Hoke to bring in the coffee, set 2 cups on the table, and leave again without a word. Long enough for the sun to climb another handwidth up the sky. Then she said, The woman you paid for is dead. Silas didn't move. He was still crouched by the fire, his hands resting on his knees, his back to her. Her name was Marybelle, Rhea went on. She was 23 years old. She had brown hair and a scar on her left wrist from a kitchen burn. She got on the coach in St. Louis on September the 14th. She never got off it. Silas stood, slowly. He turned to face her. Where? He said. North Platte, Rhea said. 3 men boarded the coach at a water stop. They took her off. I was on the coach too. I saw them do it. I tried to stop them. I couldn't. Silas's face didn't change, but his hand moved, once, to the side of his belt where his revolver hung. Who were they? He said. Rhea's gunpowder eyes met his, and for the first time something in them cracked. One of them, she said, was my brother. Outside the window, the hawk that had circled all morning suddenly folded its wings and dropped like a stone toward the grass. And in the far distance, so far it might have been imagined, a single rider crested the ridge and stood watching the house. Silas Blackwood did not react the way most men would have reacted. He did not shout. He did not curse. He did not draw his gun or throw a chair or demand that she leave his house. He simply looked at her for a long, unreadable moment, walked to the table, sat down, and poured a cup of coffee. He pushed the second cup across the wood toward her. Sit, he said. She sat. The coffee was black and bitter and hot enough to burn. Rhea wrapped both hands around the cup and did not drink. Silas took a slow sip, set the cup down, and folded his hands in front of him. Tell it, he said. From the beginning. Leave nothing out. She looked at him a long time. Then she began. Her name, she said, was Rhea Callahan, and she had been born in a mining camp in Colorado in the summer of 1859. Her mother had died of fever before she was 2. Her father had been killed in a claim dispute before she was 7. She and her older brother, Cade, had been raised by an uncle who drank too much and beat them too often. When Cade turned 16, he ran. When Rhea turned 14, she ran too. She had been running in one way or another ever since. Cade had gone bad. It was that simple, she said, and that complicated. He had fallen in with a man named Marlowe, who ran a small crew of outlaws out of the Badlands north of the Platte River. They robbed stagecoaches. They robbed banks. They robbed anything with a lock and something worth taking. And in the last 2 years they had begun to take something else. Women. Not for ransom. Not usually. For sale. There were buyers, Rhea said, in mining camps and border towns. Men who paid in gold for a woman with no family to come looking. Cade had become the man who chose them, off stagecoaches, out of boarding houses at train stations. He had a knack for it. He picked the ones nobody would miss. Marybelle had been one of those. Rhea had been tracking her brother's crew for 11 months. She had lost their trail twice, picked it up again 3 times, and finally caught up with them at the water stop in North Platte. She had been on the same stagecoach as Marybelle, riding under a false name, because she had received word that Cade would be watching that route. She had planned to follow the crew back to their camp, learn where they took the women, and bring the law down on all of it. But when Cade had climbed onto the coach and put a hand on Marybelle's arm, something had broken in Rhea. She had drawn her rifle. She had told him to let the girl go. And Cade, her own brother, had looked her in the face and said, "You always did think you were better than me, Rhea." Then he had shot Marybelle. In the chest. Right there in the coach. He had done it, Rhea said, so that Rhea would have to choose. Chase him and let the girl die alone in the dust. Or stay with the girl and lose him again. She had chosen the girl. Marybelle had died in her arms 20 minutes later, on the side of the road, under a sky that hadn't cared one bit. Silas listened to all of it without moving. When she was done, he stared at the table for a long time. Then he reached inside his coat and pulled out the folded contract. He laid it flat on the wood between them. It was a marriage contract, drawn up by a broker in St. Louis, signed by Silas Blackwood on one line and Mary Bell on the other. He looked at it a moment. Then he took a match from the tin on the table, struck it, and set the paper on fire. They watched it burn together. "Why did you come here?" Silas said when the ashes had cooled. "Because Mary Bell told me your name," Rhea said. "Before she died. She said you'd been kind to her in the letters. She said if I ever got out of that country alive, I should come here and tell you what happened. She said she owed you that much. And she said—" Rhea stopped. "She said what?" Silas asked. "She said you had a wife once, who disappeared, and that in your letters, you sounded like a man who was still looking for her." Silas's face did not change, but his hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. Outside, the wind rose. It rattled the shutters and hissed under the door. And somewhere on the ridge, a horse whickered, faint, carried on the wind. Silas heard it. So did Rhea. Their eyes met across the table. "How many of them followed you?" Silas said quietly. "I thought I lost them at the Powder River," Rhea said. "But my brother is not a man who loses trails." Silas stood. He walked to the rifle rack. He took down a Sharps buffalo gun, checked the load, and set it against the wall by the door. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the ridge. The rider was gone, but the tracks he had left would still be in the grass. "Miss Callahan," Silas said without turning, "I think you should know something about my wife." Rhea waited. "She didn't disappear in a blizzard," Silas said. "That's just what I told the town. Kora was taken 10 years ago by 3 men on horseback out of the north pasture in broad daylight. I chased them for 4 months. I lost the trail at the Powder River." He turned then, and the look on his face was not a rancher's look. It was the look of a man who had spent 10 years in a quiet, patient rage. "I never stopped looking," he said. "I just stopped talking about it." And outside, the wind carried the sound of hooves. Night came down over the Blackwood Ranch like a slow-drawn blanket. The sky went from gold to copper to a deep, aching blue, and the stars came out one at a time, cold and clear and uncountable. Somewhere out in the grass, a coyote sang a single long note and then fell silent, as if it had thought better of the noise. Silas did not light the lamps. He moved through the house in the dark, checking the shutters, checking the doors, checking the rifles. Hoke came up from the bunkhouse with a shotgun over his shoulder and a look on his face that said he already understood what was happening. He took up a position at the back window and did not speak. Rhea stood at the front window, her Winchester across her forearm, her braid pulled forward over her shoulder. She had not slept in 3 days. Her eyes burned. Her hands, though, were steady. "How many, you think?" Hoke said low. "If it's Marlowe's crew," Rhea said. 6. "If it's just Cade and a scout, 2. "And if it's neither?" Silas said. "Then we've got worse problems than I thought." Silas nodded. He crossed to the fireplace, knelt, and pulled up a loose stone from the hearth. Beneath it was a small iron box, buried in the ash of years. He lifted it out, set it on the floor, and opened it. Inside was a Colt Dragoon, an older gun, heavier, the kind of gun a man carries when he doesn't intend to come back. He loaded it slowly, each chamber, and slid it into his belt. Then he did something Rhea did not expect. He walked over to her, and he held out something in his palm. It was a small silver locket, tarnished on a broken chain. "This was Kora's," he said. "The men who took her left it in the dust. If you see it on any of them tonight, tell me." Rhea took the locket. She turned it over in her fingers. On the back, engraved in tiny script, were the initials CB. She closed her hand around it. "I'll tell you," she said. They waited. The first hour passed in silence. The second hour passed with the wind rising and the shutters beginning to knock softly against their latches. In the third hour, Hoke lifted his hand. Rider, he said. West side. Coming slow. Silas moved to the west window. Through the crack in the shutter, he watched a single horseman ride into the yard at a walk. The man wore a long black coat and a hat pulled low. He carried no visible weapon. He stopped his horse 30 feet from the porch, and he called out, in a calm and almost pleasant voice, "Silas Blackwood. My name is Elijah Marlowe. I'd like to have a word." Silas didn't answer. "I know you've got my associate's sister in there," Marlowe went on, still pleasant. "I don't hold that against you. She's a hard woman to keep hold of. I only came to offer a trade." Silas cracked the shutter another inch. Rhea moved beside him, silent as smoke. "What trade?" Silas called. "You send Rhea Callahan out, unarmed, and you walk away from all of this," Marlowe said. "You keep your ranch. You keep your men. You keep your life. I ride away, and you never see me or mine again. And if I don't?" Marlowe smiled. Rhea could see his teeth in the dim light. "Then I ride away tonight, Mr. Blackwood, and I come back tomorrow with 6 men. And the day after that with 12. And I burn this ranch to the dirt and I salt the ashes. You know I can. You know I have." Silence. Then Silas said, quietly, "Mr. Marlowe, are you the man who took Kora Blackwood, 10 years ago, out of the north pasture of this ranch?" There was a pause, a long one, and then Marlowe laughed. It was a low, unhurried, genuinely amused laugh. "So you finally figured it out," Marlowe said. "I wondered if you ever would." Silas closed the shutter. He turned to Rhea. His face, in the thin lamplight, was very calm. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I'd be obliged if you'd take the back window with Hoke. There's a rifle port in the barn loft, and Hoke knows the trick to it. I'll take the front." "He's got men in the dark," Rhea said. "He wouldn't come alone." "I know," Silas said. "I'm counting on it." He walked to the front door. He did not open it. He put his hand on the latch and he spoke, loud enough for the man in the yard to hear. "Mr. Marlowe, my wife's name was Kora. She was 26 years old when you took her. She had a laugh like water over stones. And I have been waiting 10 years for this night." Then Silas Blackwood opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The yard exploded. 3 muzzle flashes from the dark, from 3 different directions. Silas dove sideways, rolling behind the water trough, the Colt Dragoon already in his hand and firing. From the back of the house, Rhea's Winchester barked, once, twice, a third time. Hoke's shotgun boomed like a slammed door. Marlowe's horse reared and bolted. Marlowe himself dropped from the saddle and vanished behind the woodpile. For the next 4 minutes, the Blackwood Ranch was a place of thunder. Rhea, at the back window, saw a shape run from the barn toward the corrals. She let it, breathed out, and squeezed. The shape fell. In the muzzle flash, she saw its face for a half-second. It was not Cade. It was a stranger, hollow-cheeked, young. She reloaded. Her hands shook now, not from fear, from something older. And then, from the darkness by the woodpile, a voice called out. A voice she had known since she was 3 years old. "Rhea," Cade Callahan called. "Come out, sister. Come out and talk to me." She closed her eyes for one long second. When she opened them, Silas was looking at her from across the room, blood on his sleeve, the dragoon still smoking in his hand. "Your choice," he said. Rhea Callahan walked out of the Blackwood Ranch house at 4 minutes past midnight, with her Winchester lowered but not put away, and her boots making no more sound on the porch boards than a cat's paws. The yard was quiet now. Marlowe's men had pulled back into the dark, and the only light came from the moon, thin and pale, and from a lantern Hoke had hung, on Silas's word, on the north corner of the barn. The lantern threw a long yellow rectangle across the dust. In the middle of that rectangle stood Cade Callahan. He looked older than she remembered. His face was thinner. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and he was only 32 years old. He wore a duster like hers, but darker, and a pistol on each hip. He held his hands out at his sides, palms open, showing her he meant, for the moment, no harm. "Rhea," he said softly. Look at you. All grown up and hunting your own blood. You stopped being my blood when you killed Mary Bell, Rhea said. Cade tilted his head. Mary Bell was a job. She was a person. Everybody's a person, Rhea. That's never been the question. The question is whether they're your person. Rhea stopped 10 paces from him. The lantern light lit half his face and left the other half in shadow. She could feel Silas somewhere behind her. In the dark by the porch, the dragoon cocked. She could feel Hoke in the barn loft, the Sharp's rifle steady on Cade's chest. She could feel her own heart beating slow and heavy against her ribs. Cade, she said. Where's Kora Blackwood? Something flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then it was gone. Now that, he said, is an interesting question. Answer it. Rhea, come on. We're family. Come with me. Marlowe will forgive the whole business. There's money in this. Real money. Enough for you and me to walk out of this life and never look back. You always wanted to see the ocean. I'll take you to the ocean. Where is she, Cade? He sighed. He looked up at the sky for a moment, as if the stars might advise him. Then he looked back at her, and his face changed. The softness went out of it. What was left underneath was something Rhea had seen before, in their uncle's kitchen, on nights she still tried not to remember. She's alive, Cade said. Kora Blackwood. 10 years and she's still alive. Marlowe kept her. She's in a cabin in the Bighorn foothills about 2 days' ride from here. She's been there the whole time. Marlowe rides up there twice a year. He calls her his little bird. From behind Rhea, in the dark, came a sound. It was not loud. It was the sound of a man drawing a very slow breath. It was the sound of 10 years cracking open. Cade heard it too. He smiled. You want to know what I think, Silas Blackwood? I think you always knew deep down. I think that's why you never remarried. That's why you sent for a broker bride. Some quiet girl who wouldn't ask questions. Some warm body to fill the empty chair. Because you knew Kora wasn't dead. And you were afraid of what she'd become. Cade, Rhea said. Stop talking. Why? Because it's true? Because he doesn't want to hear it. Because I don't want to shoot my brother in the mouth. Cade laughed. And then, faster than she had ever seen him move, his right hand dropped to his hip. Rhea's rifle came up. She fired from the hip, one shot, clean. The bullet took him high in the right shoulder. His pistol cleared leather but never came level. Fell into the dust. He staggered back one step, then another and sat down hard on the ground. He looked at his shoulder like it belonged to somebody else. Damn, he said, almost admiringly. You always were the better shot. Then all around the yard, the dark came alive. Marlowe's men, 4 of them, opened up from 4 positions. Silas fired from the porch and rolled behind the trough again. Hoke's Sharp's rifle roared from the barn loft and a man screamed near the corrals. Rhea dropped flat, rolled behind the water pump, and levered another round into her Winchester. Someone came running from the woodpile, low and fast. She led him, breathed out, squeezed. He went down. From the far end of the yard, Marlowe himself stepped out of the shadows. He had a rifle in his hands now, a long one, and he was raising it not toward Silas, not toward Rhea, but toward Cade. Rhea saw it a full second before it happened. Cade! She shouted. Down! Cade looked up. He saw Marlowe. He saw the rifle. And he understood in that last second what his boss had come for. He was a loose end now. He knew where Kora was. He had said her name. He had said the name of the cabin. He tried to move. He couldn't. His shoulder was ruined. Marlowe fired. The bullet took Cade Callahan in the chest, from 30 feet away, and it went through him like a nail through paper. He fell backward into the dust, arms wide, eyes open to the stars. Rhea did not scream. She did not cry. She rose from behind the pump, and she walked, calmly and steadily, into the middle of the yard, with bullets from 3 directions cutting the air around her. She levered her Winchester and she fired. Once, twice, 3 times. 4. Marlowe's rifle came up. His finger found the trigger. And then Silas Blackwood stepped out from behind the trough with the Colt Dragoon in both hands, and he fired one shot. Marlowe spun halfway around. He looked down at his chest. He looked up at Silas. He opened his mouth as if to say something clever, one last time. He didn't get to. Dawn came slow and gray over the Blackwood ranch. The yard was quiet. The bodies had been gathered and laid out under a tarp behind the barn, waiting for the sheriff to ride out from Dry Fork. 2 of Marlowe's men had lived. They were tied in the tack room, and one of them was crying, and the other was not. Kate Callahan lay separate from the rest. Rhea had asked for that, and Silas had granted it without a word. She had washed her brother's face. She had closed his eyes. She had folded his hands on his chest. And then she had walked away and stood by the corral fence for 20 minutes with her back to the house, saying nothing, letting nobody see her face. When she came back inside, Silas was at the table. His left sleeve was cut away, and Hoke was finishing a rough bandage on his upper arm. The wound was clean, a graze, but it had bled through his shirt. He looked older than he had the day before. He also looked, in some strange and quiet way, younger. He looked up at her. 2 days' ride, he said. You said the Big Horn foothills. That's what he said. Will you come with me? Rhea looked at him a long time. Then she nodded once, sharp. I'll saddle the horses, she said. They rode out at 7 in the morning. 2 horses, 2 rifles, 3 days of jerky and coffee and hardtack, and 1 folded silver locket in Silas Blackwood's coat pocket. They rode north across the pale grass, and then northwest into the pine country, and then up into the foothills where the wind smelled of snow even in October. They rode mostly in silence. There was nothing to say that the road wasn't already saying. On the second night, at a small fire under a rock ledge, Rhea spoke. If she's there, she said, she may not be who she was. I know, Silas said. 10 years is a long time to be somebody's little bird. I know. She may not want to come back. Silas looked into the fire for a long moment. Then I'll ask her what she wants, he said. And I'll do it. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they came around the shoulder of a low mountain and saw the cabin. It sat in a small meadow ringed by pines, with a thin thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A single horse was tied by the porch. A woman was sitting on the porch steps, in a gray wool dress, mending a shirt. She was too far away to see clearly, but she looked up at the sound of the horses. She stood, slowly. She shaded her eyes. Silas Blackwood dismounted, 40 paces from the cabin. He handed his reins to Rhea. He walked forward alone on foot, with his hat in his hand. The woman on the porch did not move. She watched him come. When he was 10 paces away, she took 1 step forward, and then she stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. Her knees seemed to buckle and then hold. Silas, she said. Her voice was hoarse, like a voice that hadn't been used much. Kora, he said. She began to cry, not loudly, just tears running down her face, while she stood very still, as if afraid that if she moved, he might disappear. He walked the last 10 paces. He did not touch her. He stopped in front of her, and he held out the silver locket in his open palm. You dropped this, he said. A long time ago. I've been meaning to give it back. Kora Blackwood looked at the locket. She looked at his face, and then she reached out and she took his hand. Not the locket, the hand. Rhea Callahan, watching from her horse, 40 paces away, turned her face to the pines and let the wind take what it needed from her. They rode back to Dry Fork slow because Kora was not strong, and because none of the 3 of them were in any particular hurry to be anywhere but on that road, together under that October sky. The town watched them come in. Nobody spoke. Nobody had to. Word had already traveled. The way word does in country like that, on the backs of birds and the tongues of tired horses. Silas Blackwood had ridden out to find his wife, and Silas Blackwood had brought her home. And beside him rode the tall woman with the gunpowder eyes who had walked off a stagecoach 4 days earlier and said 7 words that started it all. Kora Blackwood healed slowly. Some things came back and some things did not. She learned to sleep with the shutters open again. She learned to laugh, though quieter than before. She and Silas took long walks in the pasture at dusk, and sometimes they held hands, and sometimes they did not, and either way it was enough. Rhea Callahan stayed on at the ranch through the winter. Hoke taught her how the water froze in the North Spring and how to break it every morning without spilling half. Silas taught her nothing, because there was nothing he could teach her that she didn't already know. Kora taught her, without meaning to, how a woman could be broken in 100 places and still choose, every morning, to be kind. In the spring, Rhea saddled her horse. She kissed Kora on the cheek. She shook Silas's hand. She rode out of the yard at first light, with her Winchester across her back and her brother's grave 4 days behind her and the whole wide country ahead. Some folks in Dry Fork say she went to the ocean. Some say she went back to hunting bad men, because the Badlands never did run out of them. Some say she rides through every October, quiet as smoke, and stops at the Blackwood Ranch for one night, and rides on before dawn. Silas Blackwood lived another 31 years. He was buried beside Kora, in the small graveyard on the rise above the ranch, in the spring of 1918. On his headstone, at his request, were carved only 4 words. She was worth waiting. And on a smaller stone beside theirs, placed there by a rider who came through in the fall of 1919 and left before sunrise, were carved 4 more. So was the truth. The wind in Dry Fork, Wyoming, still doesn't tell the truth. But every so often, when the fog rolls in low and the cottonwoods lean in to listen, it whispers a name it has no right to know. Rhea. And somewhere, on some road, under some sky, a woman with gunpowder eyes rides on. What would you have done in Silas Blackwood's place when the wrong bride stepped off that stagecoach? Would you have smiled? Would you have drawn? Would you have waited 10 more years, if that's what it took? Tell me in the comments below. And wherever you're watching from tonight, ride safe.